Hey guys, tonight we're going to take a little journey, not to a wedding feast or a raucous party, but to a much quieter, more intimate affair. We're going to visit the sickbed of the Middle Ages, a time when a common cold could be a spiritual crisis, and the most advanced medical advice you could get often involved a prayer, a pint of ale, and a handful of leeches. Before we begin, if you genuinely enjoy what I do here, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. It's always wonderful to know you're out there. And in the comments, let me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's a small, lovely way for us to connect across the quiet hours. Now, dim the lights, get comfortable, maybe pull the blanket up a little higher. Let's ease into a world where the line between healing and hurting was blurry at best, and a diagnosis was more of an art than a science. So as you lay there in your hut, feverish and coughing, you had a choice to make. Do you hope for the high-minded physician, the brutal barber surgeon, the mystical apothecary, or the trusted village healer? Your life could very well depend on who you chose. Once your chosen healer had arrived and examined your urine, your tongue, and the general aura of despair around you, they would deliver a diagnosis. And in the Middle Ages, almost every diagnosis came back to one elegant, all-encompassing, and profoundly wrong idea: the theory of the four humors. This concept, inherited from the ancient Greeks, particularly Hippocrates and Galen, was the unshakable foundation of Western medicine for over 1,500 years. The theory was beautifully simple. The human body was believed to contain four essential fluids, or humors. Each humor was linked to a specific organ, a season, one of the four elements, and a particular temperament. A healthy person was someone in whom these four fluids existed in perfect, harmonious balance. Sickness was, quite simply, the result of having too much or too little of one of them. First, you had blood, produced by the liver, associated with the element of air and the season of spring. A person with a dominance of blood was said to be sanguine, cheerful, optimistic, and rosy-cheeked. Too much blood, however, could lead to fever, mania, and a dangerous excess of passion. Next was phlegm, associated with the brain, the element of water, and the cold of winter. A phlegmatic person was calm, unemotional, and perhaps a bit sluggish. An excess of phlegm was thought to cause colds, coughs, and any illness that produced mucus. That cough rattling in your chest? A clear sign of too much phlegm. Then came yellow bile, produced by the spleen, associated with the element of fire and the heat of summer. A person with a healthy amount of yellow bile was choleric, ambitious, fiery, and a natural leader. But too much of it would make you angry, irritable, and prone to jaundice and digestive trouble. And finally, there was black bile, the mysterious one, associated with the gallbladder, the element of earth, and the melancholy of autumn.
A person influenced by black bile was melancholic, thoughtful, introspective, and artistic. But an excess of this dark humor would plunge you into a deep, unshakable depression. It was the source of sadness, of despair, and of what we might today call clinical depression.
This framework explained everything. It was a complete, unified theory of human health. Every condition, from a pimple to the plague, could be traced back to an imbalance of these four fluids. Your personality wasn't just a quirk of your mind. It was a direct result of your unique humoral cocktail. Your fever wasn't a symptom of infection. It was a symptom of excess blood. Your sadness wasn't a psychological state. It was a physical ailment caused by too much black bile. It made perfect sense in a way. The world was made of four elements, so why wouldn't the human body, a microcosm of the universe, be the same? It gave both the physician and the patient a sense of order in the face of chaotic and terrifying illnesses. There was a reason for your suffering, and if there was a reason, there had to be a cure. And the cure was just as logical as the diagnosis. If you had too much of something, the answer was simple. You had to get it out. This is where medieval medicine took a sharp turn into the brutal and the bloody. The primary tool for restoring balance, the go-to treatment for nearly every ailment imaginable, was bloodletting. If you had a fever, a headache, pneumonia, or even if you just felt a bit too passionate, the diagnosis was clear: an excess of hot, moist blood. The barber surgeon would be called. He'd arrive with a bowl, and his most important tool, a lancet. This was a small, sharp, pointed knife. He would tie a tourniquet around your arm, find a prominent vein, and with a quick, practiced flick of the wrist, he would make an incision. Your excess blood would pour out into the bowl, its dark red color a satisfying confirmation that the sickness was now leaving your body. You were expected to lose a fair amount until you felt faint. Fainting was often seen as a sign that the treatment was working. Your body was finally releasing its surplus heat and returning to a state of equilibrium. If cutting you open seemed a bit too direct, there was a gentler, more natural alternative: leeches. These slimy, squirming creatures were a living medical device. The healer would place them on your skin, and the leeches, eager for a meal, would latch on and begin to drink their fill. They were a more targeted approach, useful for drawing bad blood away from a specific area, like a swollen joint or a painful bruise. Each leech could consume several times its own body weight in blood, and when it was full and engorged, it would simply fall off. It was nature's own little dialysis machine. In some monasteries, they cultivated leech ponds to ensure a steady supply for the infirmary. They were, in every sense of the word, a cash crop.
So, the leeches have had their fill, and a bowl of your excess blood sits on the table. You are paler, weaker, but according to the wisdom of the age, you are now one step closer to being in balance. But the work of healing is not yet done. Removing the bad is only half the battle. Now, you need to introduce the good. For that, you would need to consult the apothecary, the master of potions and poultices, whose shop was a fragrant, dusty, and often terrifying cabinet of curiosities. Stepping into an apothecary's shop in the Middle Ages was an assault on the senses. The air was thick with 100 competing aromas. The sweet perfume of lavender and rose, the sharp tang of vinegar, the earthy smell of dried roots, and the faint unsettling scent of sulfur and decay. Bunches of herbs hung from the rafters, drying in the dim light. The shelves were a chaotic library of earthly materials, crammed with clay pots, glass vials, and wooden boxes, each with a handwritten label in abbreviated Latin. Here the natural world was catalogued, powdered, and mixed into cures for everything that could possibly ail the human body. The apothecary was a master of his craft. He was part botanist, part chemist, and part magician. His remedies fell into several categories, ranging from the sensible to the truly bizarre. The foundation of his practice was, of course, herbs. The knowledge of medicinal plants was ancient, passed down through generations, and preserved in the illustrated manuscripts of monasteries. He could provide you with a willow bark tea to ease your aches and fevers, not knowing it contains salicin, the precursor to aspirin. He might prescribe a poultice of comfrey for a broken bone, a plant now known to contain compounds that can help cell proliferation. He had mint for an upset stomach, chamomile to help you sleep, and garlic, which was believed to ward off not just vampires, but the plague itself. This was the sensible part of his trade, the part grounded in observable effects.
But then things would start to get strange. The apothecary's shelves also held remedies based on a principle known as the doctrine of signatures. This was the belief that God had marked everything in creation with a sign, or a signature, to indicate its purpose. A plant that looked like a human organ was therefore intended to treat that organ. The lungwort, a plant with spotted leaves that resembled a diseased lung, was obviously the perfect cure for respiratory ailments. The bright eye-shaped flowers of eyebright were for sore eyes. Walnuts, with their wrinkled shells resembling a skull and the meat inside looking like a brain, were prescribed for head injuries and to improve intellect. It was a beautiful, poetic system that connected humanity to the divine through visual puns. Its actual medical effectiveness was, of course, an entirely different matter.
But what if your ailment was not something a potion could fix? What if the problem was a shattered leg, a festering wound, or a rock-hard growth in your abdomen? In that case, you would return to the grim, practical world of the barber surgeon.
His craft went far beyond bloodletting and pulling teeth. He was the one who performed surgery in an age without anesthesia, without antiseptics, and with only a rudimentary understanding of human anatomy. An operation in the Middle Ages was a spectacle of speed, strength, and sheer, terrifying brutality. Let's consider an amputation. Imagine a soldier, his leg crushed in battle, and now turning black with gangrene. There was only one option. He would be taken to the surgeon, perhaps given a large quantity of wine or a piece of wood to bite down on to muffle his screams. Several strong assistants would hold him down. The surgeon would take his saw, a tool that looked unsettlingly similar to the one a butcher might use, and he would begin to cut. Speed was everything. The longer the operation took, the greater the shock to the body and the higher the chance of death. A skilled surgeon could remove a leg in under a minute. Once the limb was severed, the bleeding had to be stopped immediately. The preferred method was cauterization. The surgeon would take a poker heated in a fire until it was glowing red hot and press it against the open stump. The searing heat would burn the blood vessels shut, creating a blackened, charred seal. The smell of burning flesh would fill the air. It was an agonizing, horrific procedure, but it was often the only way to prevent a patient from bleeding to death. If you survived the pain and the shock, you then had to survive the inevitable infection that followed.
Another dramatic and, to us, baffling procedure was trepanning. This was the ancient practice of drilling, cutting, or scraping a hole in the skull. It was performed to treat a variety of conditions: skull fractures, epilepsy, and even chronic headaches or melancholy. Wound care was equally perilous. In a world without germ theory, the concept of infection was poorly understood. The pus that formed in a wound was often thought to be a good sign, a sign that the body was expelling its bad humors. This was called laudable pus. However, some surgeons did stumble upon effective techniques, even if they didn't know why they worked. They learned that washing a wound with wine, an antiseptic, helped it heal better than using water. They would stitch deep wounds closed using needles made of bone and sutures made from animal gut or silk. They would pack wounds with moss or clean linen, and sometimes even use cobwebs, which are now known to have antifungal and blood-clotting properties. It was a process of trial and error, played out over centuries on the bodies of the sick and injured. For every life saved by a lucky technique, countless others were lost to pain, shock, and infection. But most people, especially the poor, would never see the inside of a surgeon's workshop. If they became too sick to work, too old to care for themselves, or were struck down by a long-term illness, their final destination might be a hospital. But a medieval hospital was nothing like the institutions we know today. It was not primarily a place of medicine or cures. It was a place of care and of faith. But then, things would start to get strange. The apothecary's shelves also held remedies based on a principle known as the
doctrine of signatures. This was the belief that God had marked everything in creation with a sign or a signature to indicate its purpose. A plant that looked like a human organ was therefore intended to treat that organ. The lungwort, a plant with spotted leaves that resembled a diseased lung, was obviously the perfect cure for respiratory ailments. The bright, eye-shaped flowers of eyebright were for sore eyes. Walnuts, with their wrinkled shells resembling a skull and the meat inside looking like a brain, were prescribed for head injuries and to improve intellect. It was a beautiful, poetic system that connected humanity to the divine through visual puns. Its actual medical effectiveness was, of course, an entirely different matter. And then there were the truly exotic and expensive ingredients reserved for the wealthy who could afford them. Perhaps the most sought after was mumia, a powder made from grinding up actual ancient Egyptian mummies. It was believed to be a powerful cure-all, and a thriving trade developed shipping preserved bodies from the tombs of Egypt to the apothecary shops of Europe. You could, quite literally, be consuming a pharaoh to cure your headache. Bezoar stones, hard concretions found in the stomachs of goats and other animals, were thought to be a universal antidote to poison. And powdered unicorn horn, almost always the tusk of a narwhal, sold at an astronomical price, was believed to purify water and cure disease. The apothecary might also offer you powdered pearls or emeralds, as precious gems were thought to hold powerful celestial energies that could restore health and vitality. Finally, there were the animal-based remedies, which could be the most stomach-turning of all. A common prescription for a cough might be the boiled lungs of a fox, chosen for its own powerful lungs. A poultice to reduce swelling might contain goose droppings. And for epilepsy, a patient might be prescribed a drink made from the powdered skull of a man who had died a violent death. Your medicine was not meant to be pleasant. Its foul taste and repulsive ingredients were often seen as part of its power. A cure so potent had to be a challenge to consume. The apothecary would hand you your concoction, a murky potion, a sticky black salve, or a bag of dried herbs, with a set of very specific instructions. It must be taken at sunrise or under a new moon, while facing east. You must recite a specific prayer before and after. The ritual was as important as the remedy. In a world without clinical trials, faith was the most powerful ingredient of all.
We have spent our time in the quiet gloom of the sick room, with the physician and his flask of urine, the surgeon and his saw. We have seen the individual body as a battlefield of humors, a landscape to be purged and bled back into balance. But what happened when the sickness could not be contained within a single body? What happened when it spilled out into the streets,
when the entire community, the entire world seemed to fall ill at once. To understand this, we must leave the individual sickbed and step outside into the vibrant, filthy, and profoundly vulnerable world of the medieval city. Public health as a concept did not exist. There were no sanitation departments, no sewer systems, no understanding of germ theory. The very air in a medieval town was a thick soup of life and decay. The streets were narrow, unpaved alleys of mud and filth. Butchers would slaughter animals in the open, tossing blood and entrails into the central gutter. Tanneries, with their foul chemical smells, operated next to bakeries. People threw their household waste, including the contents of their chamber pots, directly out of their windows, often with a cursory shout of "Gardez-vous," a corruption of the French for "watch out for the water," as the only warning to the poor soul walking below. The rivers that flowed through these towns were both the primary source of drinking water and the public sewer. All of this waste, this urban detritus, created a powerful, omnipresent stench. And in the medieval mind, this smell was not just unpleasant, it was the very source of disease. This was the miasma theory. They believed that epidemics were caused by a miasma, a poisonous vapor or mist filled with particles of decaying matter that would corrupt the air, and when inhaled, corrupt the body. It was a logical conclusion in a way. The places that smelled the worst, the swamps, the tanneries, the graveyards, were often the places where sickness was most common. They weren't wrong about the correlation, they were just wrong about the cause. Their attempts at public health were therefore attempts at air purification. When a plague was rumored to be near, town officials would order great bonfires to be lit on street corners, hoping the heat and smoke would drive away the corrupt air. People would walk around carrying bouquets of flowers or pomanders, small metal balls filled with fragrant spices like ambergris, musk, or cloves, which they would hold to their noses in crowded places. The wealthy would burn incense in their homes. It was a fight against a bad smell, a war waged with perfume and smoke against an invisible, misunderstood enemy. They were in essence trying to use air freshener to fight a biological apocalypse. And in the middle of the 14th century, that apocalypse arrived.
In October of 1347, 12 of these Genoese death ships arrived in the harbor of Messina, Sicily. The townspeople who gathered at the docks were met with a horrifying sight. Most of the sailors aboard the ships were either dead or gravely ill, their bodies covered in strange black boils that oozed blood and pus. The Sicilian authorities ordered the fleet to be cast out of the harbor, but it was too late. The rats had already scurried down the ropes and into the city. The Black Death had arrived in Europe. The disease it brought was Yersinia pestis, a bacterium with 3 terrifying forms. The most common was the bubonic plague. Within days of being bitten by an infected flea, the victim would develop a high fever, vomiting, and extreme pain. Then came the telltale sign, the buboes. These were agonizingly painful swellings of the lymph nodes, typically in the groin, armpits, or neck, that could grow to the size of an apple.
The skin around them would often turn black as the tissue died. Death usually followed within a week. The second form was the pneumonic plague. This was when the infection moved into the lungs. It could be transmitted directly from person to person through infected droplets from a cough. It was even more deadly than the bubonic form, with a mortality rate approaching 100%, often killing its victims within 1 or 2 days. The third and deadliest form was the septicemic plague, when the bacteria entered the bloodstream directly. It caused high fevers and turned the skin dark purple or black all over the body, which is what gave the Black Death its name. It was so swift and so lethal that a person could go to bed feeling healthy and be dead by morning. As the plague spread from Italy into France, Spain, and England, it created a wave of terror that shattered the medieval world. Society began to break down. Physicians and priests, the very people meant to provide comfort, were often the first to die, as they were in constant contact with the sick. Many simply fled in terror. The wealthy locked themselves away in their country estates, hoping to wait out the storm. Parents abandoned their sick children. Husbands left their wives. The basic bonds of human compassion and family were dissolved by fear. The Italian writer Boccaccio described how, in Florence, so many bodies were brought to the churches every day that there was not enough consecrated ground to bury them. They dug great trenches in which they laid the corpses as they arrived by hundreds at a time, piling them up tier upon tier, as merchandise is stowed in a ship's hold. In the face of a cataclysm they could not understand, people searched desperately for a reason. Many believed it was a punishment from God, a divine judgment on a sinful world. This led to frantic acts of public piety. In Germany and across Europe, the flagellant movement arose. These were groups of people who would march from town to town, whipping themselves with leather scourges tipped with iron spikes. They would arrive in a town square, form a circle, and begin to chant and lash themselves in a public display of penance, their blood spattering the assembled crowds. They believed that by taking on this physical suffering, they could appease God's wrath and convince him to lift the plague. For a time, they were seen as holy men, but soon their fanaticism and their open criticism of the church led them to be condemned as heretics.
When piety failed, people turned to blame. If God wasn't the cause, then someone must be poisoning the wells. The perfect scapegoats were found in Jewish communities. Rumors spread that Jews were intentionally spreading the plague to destroy Christendom. Despite the fact that Jewish people were dying at the same rate as Christians, and that the Pope himself issued decrees stating their innocence, a wave of horrific pogroms swept across Europe. Entire communities were burned alive. In Strasbourg, an estimated 2,000 Jews were massacred in February of 1349. It was a hysterical, murderous reaction born of terror and ingrained prejudice. And then there was the opposite reaction. Faced with the near certainty of a swift and agonizing death, many people simply abandoned all restraint. If the world was ending, why not enjoy what little time was left? They broke into the cellars of the rich who had fled, and great drunken parties filled the streets. All social rules were suspended. They lived by the motto, "Eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die." The chronicles of the time are filled with stories of this sudden, desperate hedonism, a frantic dance on the edge of the grave. By the time the first wave of the plague burned itself out around 1351, it had left a scar across the face of Europe. It's estimated that between 30 and 60% of the entire population had perished. In some regions, the death toll was far higher. Entire villages were wiped off the map, leaving only silent fields and empty houses. The world that emerged from the shadow of the Black Death was fundamentally, irrevocably changed. The consequences were profound. With so many dead, the rigid structure of feudalism began to crumble. For the first time in centuries, there was a severe labor shortage. The surviving peasants found themselves in a position of unprecedented power. They could demand higher wages, better working conditions, and more freedom. When the nobility tried to enforce old wage caps, the peasants revolted. The old order of lords and serfs, which had been stable for generations, was beginning to crack. The psychological impact was just as deep. The sheer scale of the death toll shook people's faith to its core. How could a loving God allow such indiscriminate suffering? The Church, which had been unable to explain, prevent, or cure the plague, lost a great deal of its authority. People began to question its power and its role in their lives. This questioning spirit would eventually feed into the intellectual currents that led to the Renaissance and the Protestant Reformation.
The Black Death was more than just a medical event. It was a historical turning point. It accelerated a century of change into a few short, terrible years. It ended the High Middle Ages and cleared the way for the modern world to be born. It was a brutal, agonizing lesson in human fragility, a reminder that civilization is always just one microscopic organism away from collapse. And it proved that when faced with the inexplicable, humanity is capable of great compassion, profound faith, and the most unspeakable cruelty, all at the same time.
We have walked through the fever-stricken towns, witnessed the desperate courage of the surgeon's workshop, and sat in the quiet, prayer-filled halls of the hospital. We have seen how medieval people confronted the failings of the body, from a simple cough to the world-altering horror of the plague. But there were other sicknesses, other battles fought not against pestilence or injury, but within the silent, private landscapes of the mind and the sacred, perilous spaces of a woman's body. In our final chapter tonight, we turn to these deeply personal struggles, to the afflictions of the soul and the ritual of life's beginning and end. In the medieval worldview, the mind and the body were not separate. An illness of the spirit was just as real, just as physical as a broken bone. They did not have our language of psychology or neuroscience. They had the language of humors and of spirits. Mental affliction was not a chemical imbalance. It was a humoral imbalance, or worse, a spiritual corruption. The most common and strangely respected of these was melancholy. This was the ailment of scholars, poets, and mystics. Caused by an excess of black bile, the cold, dark humor, melancholy was a profound and lingering sadness. It was the weight on the soul that we might recognize today as depression. But it was not seen as a simple failing. To be melancholic was to be sensitive, introspective, and prone to deep philosophical thought. It was the temperament of genius. The treatments for melancholy were often gentle and aimed at rebalancing this dark humor with warmth and light. A physician might prescribe a diet of warm, moist foods like lamb or chicken. He would recommend listening to cheerful music, taking walks in beautiful gardens, and engaging in pleasant conversation with friends. He might advise against too much study or solitude, lest the black bile grow even more dominant. It was, in its own way, a surprisingly holistic approach, recognizing the connection between environment, activity, and mood. Madness or mania was another matter entirely. This was not the gentle sadness of the scholar, but a frightening loss of reason. It was seen as an excess of hot humors, like blood or yellow bile, causing the brain to essentially boil over. Or, in more terrifying cases, it was viewed as demonic possession. The afflicted might shout uncontrollably, tear at their clothes, or speak in strange voices. The response was often a mixture of medical treatment and spiritual warfare. The patient might be bled to rebalance their hot humors, dunked in cold water to cool their overheated brain, or be physically restrained to prevent them from harming themselves or others.
At this same time, a priest would be called to perform prayers or even an exorcism, to drive out the evil spirit that was believed to be tormenting the individual. For those whose madness was chronic, society had few good answers. Some were simply kept by their families, a sad and often hidden burden. Others were confined to monastic cells or the earliest forms of asylums,
like the Priory of St. Mary of Bethlehem in London, which would later become infamous as Bedlam. Here the care was custodial at best, and often brutal. The mentally ill were a source of fear and mystery, seen as people who had lost the one thing that made them human, their reason. They were a living testament to the fragility of the mind in a world that had few tools to understand it. Just as perilous as the afflictions of the mind were the natural, necessary trials of the female body. For a woman in the Middle Ages, there was no single event more dangerous, more surrounded by ritual, and more central to her life than childbirth. In an age of high mortality, the act of bringing a new life into the world was a brush with death itself. The birthing chamber was a uniquely female space. When a woman went into labor, men, including physicians, were strictly forbidden from entering. The event was presided over by a midwife and a gathering of female friends, relatives, and neighbors. The midwife was not a formally trained medical professional. She was a woman of experience, her knowledge passed down through generations of mothers and daughters. She knew the rhythms of labor, the positions that could ease pain, and the herbs that could help the process along. But her role was as much spiritual as it was physical. The birthing room was a sacred space, filled with prayers, relics, and religious icons. Candles would be lit before a statue of the Virgin Mary, the ultimate symbol of motherhood. The laboring woman might hold a sacred girdle or a saint's relic, drawing strength from its divine power. The process was long and arduous. Without painkillers, women endured the contractions with the support of the other women in the room who offered encouragement, massaged their backs, and prayed alongside them. But, despite the prayers and the community, things often went terribly wrong. Obstructed labor, where the baby was unable to pass through the birth canal, was a catastrophe. Without the option of a cesarean section, a procedure that was almost never performed on a living woman, it was often a death sentence for both mother and child. Postpartum infection, or childbed fever, was a rampant and invisible killer sweeping through a new mother's body in the days following the birth.
The fear of death was palpable. A woman would often prepare for childbirth as one prepares for the end of life, confessing her sins to a priest beforehand. The greatest fear was for the soul of the baby. If a newborn was weak and seemed unlikely to survive, the midwife was empowered to perform an emergency baptism on the spot, ensuring the baby's soul would enter heaven. The line between birth and death was perilously thin, and every successful delivery was seen as nothing short of a miracle, a testament to God's grace and the resilience of women. Every new cry was a victory against the darkness. And so our journey ends. We have seen a world of medicine that can seem to us almost alien in its logic and its methods. A world of humors and spirits, of prayer and pain, of bloodletting and astrology. It is easy to look back with a sense of superiority, armed with our knowledge of germs, genetics, and antibiotics. But to do so is to miss the point. The story of medieval medicine is not a story of failure. It is a story of profound, unending, and deeply human struggle. It is the story of a physician poring over ancient texts, trying to find order in the chaos of disease. It is the story of a midwife whispering words of encouragement in a dark room, using her hands and her heart to guide a new life into the world. It is the story of a community facing a terrifying plague, responding with both the best and the worst of human nature. Beneath the bizarre theories and the brutal practices lay a fundamental impulse that we still share today, the desire to understand our own fragile bodies, to comfort the suffering, and to find meaning in the face of our own mortality. They did the best they could with the knowledge they had, in a world lit by candlelight and faith. And as you drift off to sleep tonight, perhaps you can spare a final, quiet thought for them, for all the souls who placed their trust in a poultice made of herbs and hope, who faced the surgeon's knife with nothing but courage, and who prayed for a good death, surrounded by the quiet murmur of their loved ones in the long, dark night of the past.
Hey guys, tonight we leave the quiet sick room behind and venture out into the muddy, chaotic streets of the medieval world. We're going to explore a landscape not of sickness, but of sin, not of medicine, but of justice. We are going to find out what happened when you broke the law in the Middle Ages. It was a time when there were no police detectives, no DNA evidence, and the concept of innocent until proven guilty was a distant, unimaginable luxury. Instead, your guilt or innocence might be decided by the opinion of your 10 nearest neighbors, the local priest's interpretation of a festering wound, or whether you happen to float in a pond. So, before we step into this world of rough justice, if you find some comfort in these strange, sleepy stories from the past, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe. And as always, I love to hear from our quiet community, so let me know in the comments where you're listening from tonight. Now, settle in, dim the lights, let the noise of the modern world fade away. Let's journey back to a time when justice was not blind, but was instead watching you always from every direction. Our modern understanding of law is a fairly neat and tidy affair. There is one set of laws for the land, enforced by a police force and judged in a courtroom. The medieval world was not so simple. The very idea of the law was a messy, overlapping patchwork of different rules, jurisdictions, and authorities. A poor farmer didn't have to worry about one law. He had to worry about at least 3 all at the same time, and any one of them could ruin his life. First, there was the king's law. This was the high justice of the realm. The king's primary duty was to maintain the king's peace, and crimes that threatened this peace were considered the most serious. These included treason, murder, arson, and any crime committed on a major highway. These were the felonies. If you were accused of one of these, you would be judged in a royal court, and the punishments were severe and theatrical: hanging, beheading, or the truly gruesome punishment for treason, being hanged, drawn, and quartered. For the average peasant, the king's law was a distant and terrifying authority, a power you prayed you would never have to encounter directly.
Much closer to home and far more relevant to daily life was manorial law. This was the law of the local lord. Every village or manor had its own court, usually held in the great hall of the manor house, or sometimes just under a large oak tree. The lord or his appointed steward would preside over it. This court dealt with the everyday squabbles and transgressions of village life. Did your pig wander into your neighbor's garden and eat his turnips? You were heading to the manorial court. Did you fail to show up for your required labor on the Lord's land? You'd have to answer for it. Were you caught using more firewood from the communal forest than you were allowed? A fine was coming your way. Petty theft, arguments that came to blows, and disputes over land boundaries were all settled here. The punishments were usually fines, paid in money, grain, or livestock. It was less about high-minded justice and more about keeping the village running smoothly and ensuring the Lord got his dues. For most people, this was the law, a familiar, frustrating, and inescapable part of their existence. And then, weaving its way through everything was canon law, the law of the church. The church had its own courts, its own lawyers, and its own set of rules that governed the spiritual and moral life of everyone in Christendom. Canon law dealt not just with crimes, but with sins. Heresy, believing something contrary to official church doctrine, was a major crime, as were blasphemy, witchcraft, and usury, the sin of lending money at interest. But the church's reach extended into the most private parts of life. Adultery, fornication, and even gossip could land you in an ecclesiastical court. The punishments here were spiritual in nature. You might be ordered to go on a pilgrimage, to publicly confess your sins before the congregation on Sunday, or, in more serious cases, you could face excommunication, being cast out of the church, a fate that condemned your soul to eternal damnation in the eyes of the community. This patchwork of legal systems created endless confusion. An assault could be a breach of the king's peace, a local dispute for the manorial court, and a moral sin in the eyes of the church. Each authority was jealous of its own power, and they often competed over who had the right to judge a particular case. For the person accused, it was a bewildering and dangerous maze to navigate.
In this world without a police force, the very act of catching a criminal was a community obligation. There were no detectives to investigate a crime. There were only your neighbors. The system relied on two ancient and effective concepts: the hue and cry and the tithing. Imagine you are a baker and you see a man snatch a loaf of bread from your stall and run. You were expected by law to raise the hue and cry. You would shout, "Stop, thief," at the top of your lungs. This shout was a legal trigger. Every able-bodied person within earshot was required to stop whatever they were doing: milking a cow, shoeing a horse, drinking in the tavern, and join the chase. You had to run after the suspect, shouting and making noise until he was caught. It was a citizen's arrest on a massive scale. To ignore the hue and cry, to simply turn a blind eye and continue with your day, was a crime in itself. You would be fined heavily for failing in your duty to the community. It was a system that turned every village into its own police force, a chaotic, shouting, running mob sworn to uphold the peace. To further ensure everyone behaved, many parts of England used a system called the tithing. All men over the age of 12 were organized into groups of 10, known as a tithing. These 10 men were bound together by an oath and were mutually responsible for each other's conduct. If one man in your tithing broke the law, it was the duty of the other 9 to bring him before the court. If the criminal ran away and the tithing couldn't produce him, all 9 of them would be fined. This created an immense amount of social pressure. Your neighbors weren't just the people you drank with. They were your bail bondsmen, your parole officers, and your personal surveillance team. You couldn't get away with much when the 9 people closest to you were financially on the hook for your good behavior. In such a close-knit and watchful society, your reputation was everything. In a small village, there were no secrets. Everyone knew who was the honest worker, who was the village drunk, who was quick to anger, and who was known to be light-fingered. When a crime was committed and no one was caught red-handed, suspicion would naturally fall upon those with a poor reputation. A person's character was their primary defense. When you were brought before the court, you could rely on oath helpers, respected members of the community who would swear on the Bible to your good character. If you could find enough reputable people to swear for you, you might be acquitted on the strength of their oaths alone. But if no one was willing to speak for you, your situation was dire. Your guilt was already half proven by your standing in the community. But what happened when the evidence was unclear? When it was one person's word against another's with no witnesses? What happened when a respected man was accused of a terrible crime? In these moments, medieval justice turned to a higher authority. They believed that if human beings could not determine the truth, they must appeal directly to God. This appeal took the form of the trial by ordeal.
The ordeal was not a form of torture designed to extract a confession. It was a formal religious ceremony, a sacred trial overseen by a priest, designed to ask God for a sign. The logic was simple and absolute. A just and all-powerful God would not allow an innocent person to be harmed. He would perform a miracle to reveal the truth. There were several forms of ordeal, each more terrifying than the last. The most common was ordeal by hot iron. After a period of fasting and prayer, the accused would be brought into the church. A piece of iron weighing 1 to 3 pounds would be placed in a fire and heated until it glowed red. The priest would bless the iron, beseeching God to make his judgment known. Then the accused would have to carry the red-hot iron for a set distance, usually 9 feet. Their hand would immediately be bound in cloth and sealed with wax. For 3 days the hand would remain wrapped. Then, in front of the priest and the community, the bandages would be removed. If the burn was healing cleanly, without festering, it was a sign from God. The person was innocent. But if the wound was infected, blistered, and putrid, it was a sign of God's rejection. The person was guilty, and they would be taken away for punishment, their guilt proven by divine verdict. A similar test was the ordeal by hot water. A large cauldron of water would be heated to boiling. A stone would be dropped into it. The accused had to plunge their arm into the boiling water, sometimes up to the elbow, and retrieve the stone. As with the hot iron, the arm would then be bandaged and examined 3 days later for signs of divine healing or festering guilt. One can only imagine the terror of facing such a trial, where your earthly fate depended on how your flesh reacted to a severe burn. Perhaps the most psychologically strange was the ordeal by cold water. This ordeal was typically reserved for those of lower status. The accused would be bound by their hands and feet, and then thrown into a nearby river or pond. The water itself was considered an element of God's creation, a symbol of purity. It had been blessed by the priest before the ceremony. The theory was that the pure water would accept an innocent person, drawing them down into its depths, but it would reject a guilty person, causing them to float on the surface. So, if you sank, you were innocent. If you floated, you were guilty. A rope was tied to the accused so that if they did sink, they could quickly be pulled back up to safety. But the grim irony was obvious to all. The very sign of your innocence involved nearly drowning, while the sign of your guilt allowed you to bob safely on the surface, ready to be pulled out and punished. These trials were not the wild justice of a mob. They were deeply embedded in the legal and religious fabric of the early Middle Ages. They were a solution to the problem of uncertainty. In a world that believed utterly in the constant presence and intervention of God in human affairs, asking for his direct judgment was the most logical thing one could do. For centuries,
The fate of thousands of people was decided not by evidence, but by fire and water, and by the healing power of their own bodies. We left our medieval ancestors in a world governed by divine judgment, where the truth of a crime was revealed in the sizzle of hot iron on flash, or the murky depths of a village pond. The trial by ordeal was the ultimate appeal, a system built on the unshakable belief that God would always intervene on the side of the innocent. But the world was changing. In the high-minded halls of the church, theologians and legal scholars were beginning to have second thoughts. The ordeal, once seen as a sacred rite, was starting to look less like a request for divine aid and more like a demand. And testing God was in itself a grave sin. This shift in thinking culminated in a single momentous decision that would dismantle the very foundation of early medieval justice. In the year 1215, a gathering of the most powerful churchmen in Europe convened in Rome for the Fourth Lateran Council. Among their many decrees, they issued one that would echo through the courts of Christendom for centuries to come. They forbade priests from participating in any trial by ordeal. Without the priest to bless the water or the iron, without the sacred rites of the church to frame the event, the ordeal lost its legitimacy. It ceased to be a holy sacrament and became mere, meaningless brutality. This created an immediate and profound crisis in the legal system. If you could no longer ask God directly who was guilty, how were you supposed to find out the truth? For centuries, the ordeal had been the final answer for any case that lacked clear witnesses or a confession. Now, that option was gone. It left a vacuum at the heart of the justice system. The kings, lords, and sheriffs of Europe were left scrambling, forced to invent or adopt a new way of separating the guilty from the innocent. They needed a method that relied not on miracles, but on men. The solution they found would, over many centuries, evolve into a system that we ourselves still use today: the jury.
The idea of a jury did not appear out of thin air. Its roots lay in an administrative practice used by Norman kings. When a king wanted to know the facts about a particular region, who owned what land, how much tax was owed, what local customs were, he would summon a group of local men of good standing. These men would be placed under oath, or juré in French, from which we get our word jury. They would then be required to answer the king's questions truthfully, based on their collective local knowledge. This was an inquest, a way of gathering information. The most famous example of this is the Domesday Book, a massive survey of England commissioned by William the Conqueror. After the church abandoned the ordeal in 1215. This royal tool of fact-finding was ingeniously adapted for criminal justice. Instead of asking the men about land ownership, the court would ask them about a crime. A group of 12 good men and true from the local area would be assembled to hear a case. But it is here that we must be very careful not to impose our modern understanding on the past. The medieval jury was fundamentally different from the jury of today. Our ideal juror is impartial, a blank slate, who knows nothing about the case until the evidence is presented in court. The medieval juror was the exact opposite. He was chosen precisely because he knew the people involved. He lived in the same village as the accused and the accuser. He knew their families, their reputations, their past disputes, and their character. The jurors were not there to listen to lawyers present evidence. They were there to act as a panel of local experts to deliberate amongst themselves and to declare, based on their own knowledge and the talk of the town, what they believed had actually happened. They were, in effect, both witnesses and judges. Their verdict was not a reaction to evidence, but a statement of community knowledge. In this system, a person's reputation was, more than ever, their most critical asset. An accusation against a man known for his honesty and piety would be met with skepticism by a jury of his peers. But an accusation against a known drunkard and troublemaker was already halfway to being a conviction. Sometimes a defendant could rely on a process called compurgation, or oath-helping. To prove their innocence, they had to gather a certain number of people, often 12, who would come to court and swear on the Bible that they believed the defendant's own oath of innocence was true and clean. They weren't swearing that they witnessed anything. They were swearing to the good character of the accused. If you could find 12 reputable neighbors willing to risk their immortal souls by swearing a false oath for you, the court would often accept this as proof of your innocence. But if you couldn't, if your reputation was so poor that no one would stand for you, it was taken as a powerful sign of your guilt.
This new system slowly took hold, but it was far from perfect. Juries could be bribed. They could be intimidated by powerful lords. Their verdicts could be driven by personal grudges, local politics, and village gossip. And yet, it represented a monumental shift. It moved the center of justice away from the unpredictable will of God and placed it into the hands of the community. The truth was no longer sought in a divine sign, but in the collective consensus of ordinary men and women. It was a messy, flawed, and deeply human solution, but it planted the seed of the principle that a person should be judged by their peers. While commoners were adapting to the new world of jury trials, The nobility had another, far more dramatic option available to them. For matters of great honor, disputed inheritances, or accusations of treason, a nobleman could avoid the judgment of a jury and instead demand a trial by combat. This was the ultimate expression of aristocratic justice, a system where legal disputes were settled not by deliberation, but by a formal, ritualized duel. The logic behind trial by combat was similar to the old trial by ordeal. It was an appeal to God to reveal the righteous party. The participants were not merely fighting each other, they were placing their cause in God's hands, with the firm belief that He would grant victory to the one who was in the right. To lose the fight was not just a personal defeat, it was a divine judgment against you. Guilt or innocence was proven at the point of a sword. A trial by combat was a highly ceremonial affair. It would take place in a specially prepared field known as the lists, surrounded by spectators, including the king or a high-ranking noble who would act as judge. The two combatants, the accuser and the accused, would arrive in full armor, often on horseback. They would take solemn oaths before the duel began, swearing to the truth of their cause and placing their faith in God's judgment. Priests would be present, blessing the combatants and the field. Then, at the sound of a trumpet, the two men would charge at each other with lances, swords, axes, or maces. The fight would continue until one of three conclusions was reached. One man could be killed. He who died was declared guilty. One man could surrender by crying out the word "Craven." To do so was to admit defeat and therefore guilt. This was an act of immense dishonor, and the man who yielded was often executed immediately after the fight anyway. The third possibility was that the fight would continue until sunset. If the accuser had not managed to defeat the accused by the time the sun went down, it was seen as a sign that God did not favor his cause, and the accused would be declared innocent.
But what if the person involved in the legal dispute was unable to fight? What if it was a woman, a child, an elderly man, or a member of the clergy, like a priest or a monk? The law provided a fascinating solution. They could hire a champion. A champion was a professional warrior, a swordsman for hire, who would fight in the legal battle on their behalf. This turned the system of divine justice into something far more pragmatic. Your innocence could depend less on the righteousness of your cause and more on the size of your purse. A wealthy monastery or a rich widow could afford to hire the strongest, most skilled warrior in the land to be their champion. A poorer person would have to make do with a less reputable fighter. The outcome of the champion's fight was legally binding on the person they represented. If your champion won, your case was won. If your champion was defeated or killed, you were declared guilty and would face the legal consequences, which could include the forfeiture of your land or even your own execution. This led to a strange world where professional fighters were an essential part of the legal system, and your life and honor could be outsourced to a man with a strong sword arm. Trial by combat was a system that perfectly reflected the values of the warrior aristocracy. It celebrated martial prowess, personal honor, and a belief in a God who actively intervenes in the affairs of men. However, like the ordeal, it gradually fell out of favor. Kings and legal thinkers began to see it as a brutal and unreliable way to determine the truth. The outcome, they noticed, often seemed to depend more on a fighter's skill or pure luck than on divine will. While it was never formally abolished in England and technically remained a legal possibility until the 19th century, its use became increasingly rare. The state preferred the more predictable and controllable justice of the courtroom and the jury. The age of trial by miracle and trial by battle was slowly giving way to an age of trial by evidence and trial by men, a process that would define the very nature of law and order for the modern world.
But the pinnacle of medieval punishment, the most elaborate and gruesome spectacle the state could devise, was reserved for the most unforgivable crime of all, high treason. To betray one's king was to betray the divinely appointed order of the universe. The punishment had to be correspondingly extreme. For this crime, the sentence was to be hanged, drawn, and quartered. This was a horrific, step-by-step process of ritualized destruction. First, the condemned traitor would be tied to a wooden frame and dragged by a horse through the streets to the place of execution, a preliminary punishment to begin their suffering. Then they would be hanged by the neck, but cut down while still alive, gasping for air. While conscious, they would be laid on a table and disemboweled. Their entrails would be pulled out and burned before their own eyes. Only then would they be beheaded. Finally, the body would be hacked into 4 quarters. The ordeal was over for the traitor, but the punishment was not. The head would often be placed on a pike and displayed at a prominent landmark like London Bridge. The 4 quarters of the body would be sent to different cities across the kingdom and put on public display, a grisly, kingdom-wide warning of the ultimate fate of those who dared to defy their king. It was the law in its most absolute and terrifying form.
In our last chapter, we witnessed the slow, uncertain dawn of a new kind of justice. We saw the divine judgment of the ordeal give way to the collective wisdom of the jury and the solemn appeal of trial by combat. A verdict had been reached, not by God,
but by men. But a verdict is merely a word. What gives that word its power, its terror, its ability to hold a society together is what comes next. Tonight we turn our gaze to the consequences. We will explore the grim and varied landscape of medieval punishment, a world where justice was not something to be served in private, but a raw and brutal public spectacle. To understand medieval punishment, we must first understand its purpose. It was not, as we might think today, about rehabilitation. The idea of reforming a criminal's character was an alien concept, nor was it solely about retribution, an eye for an eye, though that was certainly a part of it. The primary purposes of punishment were public shame, public deterrence, and the restoration of order, both social and divine. A crime was not just an act against an individual. It was a tear in the fabric of the community, an offense against the Lord, the King, and God Himself. The punishment, therefore, had to be a public mending of that tear, a visceral and unforgettable lesson for all to see. This is why punishment was almost never carried out behind closed doors. It was theater, an execution, a public whipping, or a day in the stocks was a major community event. People would gather from the surrounding villages. Sellers might set up stalls, and a grimly festive atmosphere could take hold. This was not because medieval people were inherently cruel. It was because they understood punishment as a form of communication. The body of the criminal became a public text, on which the power of the law was written for all to read. The pain, the shame, and the suffering of the offender served as a powerful sermon on the consequences of sin and disorder. It was a brutal but effective form of mass education. The ladder of punishment had many rungs, and the one you found yourself on depended heavily on the nature of your crime and your station in life. For the vast majority of offenses dealt with in the local manorial courts, the punishment was simple and practical: a fine. If your livestock wandered onto your neighbor's land, you paid a fine. If you were caught brewing ale that was weaker than the required standard, you paid a fine. If you got into a fist fight in the village square, you paid a fine. Fines were the grease that kept the wheels of local justice turning. They compensated the wronged party, punished the offender, and, most conveniently, provided a steady stream of revenue for the lord of the manor. For a peasant living on the edge of subsistence, a fine of a few shillings or a bushel of grain was a significant hardship, but it was infinitely better than the alternatives.
If your crime was more serious, or if you were a repeat offender, you might find yourself elevated to a more visible form of punishment, one designed to inflict not physical pain, but social death. This was the punishment of public shame. The most common instruments for this were the stocks and the pillory. The stocks were a simple wooden contraption that clamped your ankles, forcing you to sit, exposed, in the village square. The pillory was a more severe device that secured your head and hands, forcing you to stand, bent over and helpless. To be placed in the pillory was to be officially stripped of your dignity. A sign, sometimes called a charter, would often be hung around your neck, detailing your crime for all to see. A cheater with false dice, a seller of bad meat, a spreader of false rumors. You would be left there for hours, sometimes days. But the wooden frame was only part of the punishment. The true pain came from the community itself. Your friends, your neighbors, the people you saw every day were now invited, even encouraged, to participate in your humiliation. They would jeer, spit, and hurl things at you. This could range from soft, rotting vegetables and mud to more dangerous projectiles like rocks and animal dung. The experience was not just uncomfortable, it was profoundly degrading, a ritual that publicly cast you out from the community of the honest. For crimes that the authorities wanted to mark permanently, the punishment moved from temporary shame to lifelong disfigurement. Mutilation served as a permanent, walking advertisement for the consequences of crime. A person convicted of serious theft might be branded on the cheek or thumb with a hot iron, the letter T marking them as a thief for the rest of their days. This mark meant they would be viewed with suspicion wherever they went, a constant physical reminder of their past transgression. In some cases, the punishment was more direct and symbolic. A perjurer, someone who had sworn a false oath, might have their tongue pierced. A poacher caught hunting in the king's forest might have a hand or an ear cut off. This was not just a punishment, it was a crippling. It reduced a person's ability to work and survive, casting them into a life of begging and dependency. The logic was brutal. You used your hand to steal, so you will lose your hand. The body itself bore the sentence, a living warning to others.
When the crime was so severe that fines, shame, or mutilation were deemed insufficient, the offender faced the final rung on the ladder. They faced the ultimate price, death. Capital punishment in the Middle Ages was as varied as it was terrifying, with the method of execution carefully chosen to match the nature of the crime and the social status of the criminal. For the common thief, the burglar, or the murderer, the most common fate was hanging. The gallows were often erected at a prominent place, such as a major crossroads or on a hill overlooking the town. The journey to the gallows was the final act of public theater. The condemned would be paraded through the streets in a cart, often with a priest walking alongside, urging them to make a final confession. This procession was slow,
allowing the crowds to gather and witness the law taking its course. At the gallows, the criminal might be allowed to make a final speech. Some confessed and asked for forgiveness. Others remained defiant to the end. The execution itself was a crude and grim affair. There was no calculated long drop to ensure a quick death by a broken neck. The condemned was simply hoisted up or pushed from a ladder, and they would die a slow, agonizing death by strangulation, kicking and twitching at the end of the rope for several minutes. To ensure the lesson was not forgotten, the body was often left to hang for days, sometimes weeks, rotting and picked at by crows, a decomposing scarecrow warning all who passed by. For members of the aristocracy, hanging was considered a dishonorable commoner's death. A nobleman or noblewoman condemned to die was granted the privilege of beheading. This was seen as a much quicker, more dignified, and more martial end. It was typically carried out with a sword or a heavy axe. However, its swiftness depended entirely on the skill of the executioner. A skilled executioner who could sever the head with a single clean blow was a highly sought-after professional. But an inexperienced or clumsy executioner could turn the event into a horrific bloodbath, taking multiple hacking blows to complete the task. The fear of a bungled beheading was a very real one for a noble facing the block. For the most heinous spiritual crimes, particularly heresy and witchcraft, the prescribed punishment was burning at the stake. In the eyes of the Church, fire was a purifying element, while the heretic's body was corrupt and had to be destroyed to prevent their dangerous ideas from spreading. The flames offered a final, terrible chance for their soul to be cleansed. This was one of the cruelest and most agonizing ways to die. The condemned would be tied to a large wooden post with bundles of wood piled around their feet. The fire would be lit, and the victim would be slowly roasted alive, the smoke and flames suffocating them long before death brought an end to their agony. The crowd would watch in awed silence, witnessing what they believed to be the fires of hell being visited upon the earth to purge an unholy sin.
For members of the aristocracy, hanging was considered a dishonorable commoner's death. A nobleman or noblewoman condemned to die was granted the privilege of beheading. This was seen as a much quicker, more dignified, and more martial end. It was typically carried out with a sword or a heavy axe. However, its swiftness depended entirely on the skill of the executioner. A skilled executioner who could sever the head with a single clean blow was a highly sought-after professional. But an inexperienced or clumsy executioner could turn the event into a horrific bloodbath, taking multiple hacking blows to complete the task. The fear of a bungled beheading was a very real one for a noble facing the block. For the most heinous spiritual crimes, particularly heresy and witchcraft,
The prescribed punishment was burning at the stake. In the eyes of the church, fire was a purifying element, while the heretic's body was corrupt and had to be destroyed to prevent their dangerous ideas from spreading. The flames offered a final, terrible chance for their soul to be cleansed. This was one of the cruelest and most agonizing ways to die. The condemned would be tied to a large wooden post with bundles of wood piled around their feet. The fire would be lit, and the victim would be slowly roasted alive, the smoke and flames suffocating them long before death brought an end to their agony. The crowd would watch in awed silence, witnessing what they believed to be the fires of hell being visited upon the earth to purge an unholy sin. But the pinnacle of medieval punishment, the most elaborate and gruesome spectacle the state could devise, was reserved for the most unforgivable crime of all, high treason. To betray one's king was to betray the divinely appointed order of the universe. The punishment had to be correspondingly extreme. For this crime, the sentence was to be hanged, drawn, and quartered. This was a horrific, step-by-step process of ritualized destruction. First, the condemned traitor would be tied to a wooden frame and dragged by a horse through the streets to the place of execution, a preliminary punishment to begin their suffering. Then they would be hanged by the neck, but cut down while still alive, gasping for air. While conscious, they would be laid on a table and disemboweled. Their entrails would be pulled out and burned before their own eyes. Only then would they be beheaded. Finally, the body would be hacked into 4 quarters. The ordeal was over for the traitor, but the punishment was not. The head would often be placed on a pike and displayed at a prominent landmark like London Bridge. The 4 quarters of the body would be sent to different cities across the kingdom and put on public display, a grisly, kingdom-wide warning of the ultimate fate of those who dared to defy their king. It was a punishment designed not just to kill a man, but to obliterate his memory and terrorize his would-be sympathizers. It was the law in its most absolute and terrifying form.
If your crime was more serious, or if you were a repeat offender, you might find yourself elevated to a more visible form of punishment, one designed to inflict not physical pain, but social death. This was the punishment of public shame. The most common instruments for this were the stocks and the pillory. The stocks were a simple wooden contraption that clamped your ankles, forcing you to sit exposed in the village square. The pillory was a more severe device that secured your head and hands, forcing you to stand, bent over and helpless. To be placed in the pillory was to be officially stripped of your dignity. A sign, sometimes called a charter, would often be hung around your neck, detailing your crime for all to see. A cheater with false dice, a seller of bad meat, a spreader of false rumors. You would be left there for hours, sometimes days. But the wooden frame was only part of the punishment. The true pain came from the community itself. Your friends, your neighbors, the people you saw every day were now invited, even encouraged, to participate in your humiliation. They would jeer, spit, and hurl things at you. This could range from soft, rotting vegetables and mud to more dangerous projectiles like rocks and animal dung. The experience was not just uncomfortable, it was profoundly degrading, a ritual that publicly cast you out from the community of the honest. For crimes that the authorities wanted to mark permanently, the punishment moved from temporary shame to lifelong disfigurement. Mutilation served as a permanent walking advertisement for the consequences of crime. A person convicted of serious theft might be branded on the cheek or thumb with a hot iron, the letter T marking them as a thief for the rest of their days. This mark meant they would be viewed with suspicion wherever they went, a constant physical reminder of their past transgression.
In some cases, the punishment was more direct and symbolic. A perjurer, someone who had sworn a false oath, might have their tongue pierced. A poacher, caught hunting in the king's forest, might have a hand or an ear cut off. This was not just a punishment, it was a crippling. It reduced a person's ability to work and survive, casting them into a life of begging and dependency. The logic was brutal. You used your hand to steal, so you will lose your hand. The body itself bore the sentence, a living warning to others. When the crime was so severe that fines, shame, or mutilation were deemed insufficient, the offender faced the final rung on the ladder. They faced the ultimate price, death. Capital punishment in the Middle Ages was as varied as it was terrifying, with the method of execution carefully chosen to match the nature of the crime and the social status of the criminal. For the common thief, the burglar, or the murderer, the most common fate was hanging. The gallows were often erected at a prominent place, such as a major crossroads, or on a hill overlooking the town. The journey to the gallows was the final act of public theater. The condemned would be paraded through the streets in a cart, often with a priest walking alongside, urging them to make a final confession. This procession was slow, allowing the crowds to gather and witness the law taking its course. At the gallows, the criminal might be allowed to make a final speech. Some confessed and asked for forgiveness. Others remained defiant to the end. The execution itself was a crude and grim affair. There was no calculated long drop to ensure a quick death by a broken neck. The condemned was simply hoisted up or pushed from a ladder, and they would die a slow, agonizing death by strangulation, kicking and twitching at the end of the rope for several minutes. To ensure the lesson was not forgotten, the body was often left to hang for days, sometimes weeks, rotting and picked at by crows. A decomposing scarecrow
warning all who passed by.
We have walked the path of the medieval accused, from the first shout of the hue and cry to the grim finality of the gallows. We have seen justice dispensed through divine miracle, through the verdict of neighbors, and at the point of a sword. We have witnessed the horrifying theater of public punishment. But our journey is not quite complete. There remain shadowed corners of the medieval legal world to explore, places where the law operated differently, where criminals were not men but ideas, and where justice could be found not in a courtroom, but by desperately clinging to the door of a church. Tonight, in our final chapter, we venture into these liminal spaces. We will face the cold certainty of the Inquisition, flee into the wild greenwood with the outlaw, and seek a final desperate hope in the rite of sanctuary, before we reflect on the long dark shadow that this world of justice casts upon our own. While the king's courts and the Lord's courts dealt with crimes of the flesh and of property, the church was engaged in a war for the soul, and its ultimate weapon in this war was a special tribunal, an institution whose very name still evokes images of dark chambers, hooded figures, and whispered accusations, the Holy Inquisition. The Inquisition's purpose was not to prosecute common criminals, but to hunt down a far more insidious enemy, the heretic. A heretic was a person who, despite being baptized a Christian, held beliefs that directly contradicted the established doctrines of the Church. In an age where faith was the glue that held society together, heresy was seen as a spiritual disease, a cancer that could corrupt the entire community and endanger countless souls. It was treason against God.
The process of the Inquisition was methodical and chillingly bureaucratic. When inquisitors, usually highly educated Dominicans or Franciscans, arrived in a town suspected of heretical activity, they would begin with a period of grace. They would preach in the local church and announce that anyone guilty of heresy had a set amount of time, perhaps a month, to come forward, confess their sins, and receive a light penance. It was a chance for a clean slate. After this period ended, the real work began. The inquisitors would start accepting accusations. Neighbors could denounce neighbors, often anonymously. Old grudges and village disputes could easily curdle into deadly accusations of heresy. Once accused, you were summoned before the inquisitors. The interrogation that followed was not a simple questioning. It was a sophisticated intellectual and psychological battle. The inquisitors were expert theologians, masters of logic. They would ask carefully worded questions about the nature of God, the sacraments, and the soul. Questions designed to trap the uneducated or the doctrinally confused. You were not told who had accused you, nor what the specific accusation was. You were simply expected to search your own conscience and confess your failings. This process could go on for days or weeks. If a confession was not forthcoming, the inquisitors could turn to other methods of persuasion. The accused might be imprisoned, sometimes in solitary confinement, and given a restricted diet to weaken their resolve. And then there was torture. In the eyes of the Church, torture was not a punishment. Its official purpose was to break the stubbornness of the body to allow the soul to tell the truth and therefore be saved. It was, in their twisted logic, an act of mercy. The accused would be shown the instruments, the rack, the strappado, and given one last chance to confess. If they refused, the torture would be applied, carefully, methodically, and documented in detail by a scribe.
Once the Inquisition had its confession, a sentence was passed at a large public ceremony known as an auto da fe, an act of faith. The punishments varied. For those who confessed early, the penance might be a pilgrimage, the wearing of a yellow cross on their clothing as a mark of shame, or a fine. For more serious heretics, who eventually recanted, the sentence might be life imprisonment. But for the relapsed heretic, or the one who stubbornly refused to confess and repent, the Church had a final solution. The inquisitors themselves, as men of God, were forbidden from shedding blood, so they would perform a final, chillingly bureaucratic act. They would relax the heretic to the secular arm. This meant they would officially hand the condemned person over to the local lord or king's authorities. With this act, the Church washed its hands of the affair. It was the secular ruler who would then carry out the final sentence, which for unrepentant heresy was almost always the same, burning at the stake. But what if you were accused of a regular crime, a secular one, and you knew you could not win your case? What if the jury of your neighbors was against you, or you were caught red-handed? For many, the only option was to run. To flee justice was to enter a terrifying legal state, to become an outlaw. To be declared an outlaw was more than just being a wanted man. It was to be legally erased from humanity. An outlaw lost all of their property, all of their rights, and all of the law's protection. The formal declaration was caput gerat lupinum, a Latin phrase meaning let him wear a wolf's head. This was not a metaphor. It meant that, in the eyes of the law, the outlaw was no longer a person. They were a beast, a wolf, and anyone who found them could kill them on sight, with no legal consequence. To kill an outlaw was not murder. It was like killing a predator, an act of public service. This is the world from which the romantic legends of figures like Robin Hood emerged. The idea of a band of merry men living freely in the greenwood, defying a corrupt sheriff, and robbing from the rich to give to the poor, is a powerful and enduring fantasy. But the reality of an outlaw's life was far from merry. The forest was not a welcoming refuge.
It was a cold, damp, and dangerous place. Outlaws survived by poaching deer from the king's forest, a crime in itself punishable by mutilation or death, and by robbing travelers on lonely roads. They were hunted, not just by the sheriff's men, but by any ambitious peasant hoping to claim a bounty. They lived in constant fear, sleeping in makeshift shelters, often hungry, and cut off from all family and community. While they were outside the law, they were not free from it. Its shadow followed them everywhere, a constant threat of a violent, anonymous death. For a fugitive on the run, with the hue and cry closing in behind them, there was one last desperate hope. It was a loophole in the system, an ancient right that pitted the king's law against the law of God. It was the right of sanctuary. Since the early days of Christianity, the church building itself was considered consecrated ground, a sacred space. By custom and by law, secular authorities were forbidden from committing acts of violence within its walls. A fugitive who could physically reach a church by literally clinging to the sanctuary knocker on its great door before they were caught could claim sanctuary. Once inside, they were under the protection of the church. The sheriff and his men, the angry mob of the hue and cry, had to stop at the church door. They could not enter to seize the fugitive. They could surround the church to prevent escape, but they could not cross the threshold. The fugitive was safe for a time. They would be given food by the churchmen, and for a period, often 40 days, they would live in this strange legal limbo. During this time, they had to make a choice.
Their first option was to surrender and face trial in the secular court. Given that they had just been desperately fleeing that very fate, this was not a popular choice. The second, more common option was to confess their crime to the coroner and agree to abjure the realm. This was a formal process of agreeing to leave the kingdom forever. After confessing, the fugitive would be declared an exile. They would be stripped to their undergarments, and a simple wooden cross would be placed in their hands. They would then have to walk barefoot from their church of sanctuary to the nearest seaport, taking a route designated by the coroner. They could not stray from this path. To do so was to instantly become an outlaw, a wolf's head, killable on sight. The journey was a public ritual of shame. Upon reaching the port, they were to take the first available ship sailing to a foreign land, never to return to their home kingdom again, upon pain of death. It was a way for the law to purge itself of a criminal, without a trial or an execution. It was a sentence of social death, a one-way ticket into a new and uncertain life. And so, our long look into the world of medieval crime and punishment comes to an end. It has been a journey through a landscape that is at once familiar and utterly alien. We have seen a world that desperately craved order, yet its methods of achieving it seemed to us like a form of madness. It was a system built on a foundation of contradictions, a belief in a just God who demanded brutal ordeals, a system of community justice that could be twisted by petty grudges, a set of punishments designed to be theatrical lessons written in pain and blood.
What are we to make of it all? It is tempting to dismiss it as a dark and barbaric age, but to do so is to ignore the thread of logic, however twisted, that runs through it all. In the hue and cry and the tithing system, we see a profound belief in community responsibility. In the trial by jury, we see the first fragile seeds of the idea that a person should be judged by their peers. And in the very brutality of the punishment still be heard faintly today. In our debates about the purpose of punishment, in our belief in the judgment of a jury, and in the way our communities still grapple with how to treat those who break the rules, we are asking the same fundamental questions they did. We have traded the gallows for the prison cell, and the ordeal by fire for the trial by evidence. But the search for a just and orderly world continues. And as you close your eyes tonight, you can let the noise of that search fade away, leaving only the quiet of the present moment, a peace the men and women of the past could only have prayed for.